Ladies, gentlemen, screenagers all across the land, welcome back to the Canon and Essential Movie Watch List. My name is Raf. Welcome back. We're here, season 4. We're kicking things off. You've been waiting for it, and we have finally returned. We've got more great movies lined up for you this season. We're starting things off today with Cool Hand Luke. I'm very excited to talk about it. I've got a very special guest who's going to be joining me for the conversation. We spoke about it before the mics turned on, how I'm going to completely butcher his name, so I apologize in advance. But Stephen Gillespie, welcome to the show.
It's close and almost correct, so I'll take it.
Damn it!
Hi, I'm Stephen Gillespie. It's a pleasure to be here.
How's it going? Welcome to the show.
It's going very good, thank you. Very happy to be here. Happy to have revisited this movie and now to have a large conversation around it. I've not seen this movie for a long time. So it's been a joy to come back to it. How are you?
I'm swell. I had not seen this movie prior to
watching
it for this recording, so that was cool to check it out. I am also excited to talk about it. I'm also excited to have our first Brit on the show. I think you are the first.
Which makes sense because Britain is also a wasteland, I would say. So increasingly so.
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say I'm a full-on Anglophile, but I have.
That'd be a negative thing to be, I would say. It's a bad
bits
hobby.
of it in me. I enjoy it. I spent a summer studying there.
Oh, nice.
In London, so I tried to throw myself into the culture. I annoy my friends back here in the States when I say things like proper or footy or telly or chippery, like all of those things. They're like, dude, you were in London for like 2 months. What are you doing?
It's like, it changed me. Me.
Like I'm a different person. You guys don't get it. I'm essentially British now.
Okay? We accept you happily.
I say the tube.
Okay? Oh, nice.
Instead of the subway. Yeah. I don't actually. I still say tube. But yeah, very excited to have you on to talk about Cool Hand Luke. Before we actually get into the movie itself, you are joining us because we are part of a really exciting film podcasting Discord where we were
a group of friends from across the airwaves. Because we were both actually recently on the podcast of the person that runs this. So Brian Loomis' What a Picture podcast. Because I joined that recently, and I was on it a couple of episodes back as well.
Nice. What movie did you join them for?
I joined to talk about the movie that is international film as a whole. So, I previously was on to talk about Mirror, the Tarkovsky movie.
Okay, nice.
But I was on this time to talk about 2023 and 24's international film, both giving top fives and talking about films that ain't American.
That's awesome. That sounds great. I have not listened to that episode yet, but I will definitely be checking that out.
Okay.
Listeners, definitely check that out as well. But you have your own show.
It's true. It's true. At least one. So yeah, primarily of the Stacks, which is myself and my friend Jack. Hence Stacks. I'm Stephen. He is Jack. I'm the Sturt. His Ack. Where we do seasons of coverage. So directors, movements, etc. We've just wrapped up a season on Sam Fuller, one of my absolute favorite film directors. As we kept saying, your filmmaker's favorite filmmaker. Your favorite filmmaker's favorite filmmaker. That makes more sense. It made sense still. So we covered his films, things like Shot Corridor, Naked Kiss, The Big Red One, and Wider Things. And now we're just about to start a Giallo season. Nice. Giallo movies, which we're starting with the film Giallo, the 2009 film Giallo, which is terrible. So there you go.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it.
You'd be familiar with the director, but has such hits as Tenebrae and Suspiria under his belt. But 2009's Giallo, not one of his best.
Not one of his best. That's awesome. That sounds great. I haven't listened to the Fuller series. I actually wasn't really familiar with his work until I saw that you guys had done the series. But your favorite filmmaker's favorite filmmaker totally makes sense. I'm sure if I were to start like digging into his work and who he influenced, I would totally see it immediately. So
it's a lovely conversation in line with stuff that's going on in Cool Hand Luke, because I feel that Cool Hand Luke is on this like ushering phase of bringing in new Hollywood. It's one of those like vanguard films, along with Bonnie and Clyde, etc. Of we are there, we are almost there, and Rebel Without a Cause, I guess, to a lesser extent, that's earlier. Whereas Sam Fuller's over there in the corner, working in low budgets, doing this stuff way ahead of time, and is not part of these wider movements. But things like Shot Corridor definitely harder, more brash, but the more interesting stuff about Cool Hand Luke, philosophically and about the state of America and the human condition is in his work, definitely. But he's a much brasher film director, which I have a lot of time for.
I love that. I totally love that. How did the show get started? How do you and Jack know each other? What's the backstory?
So the show got started because we are both Brits, but not every Brit knows each other. But we, in the most weird of ways. So I was already like doing film podcasting in the background. I've been doing multiple things. I've got other ones that still go in. So I've got a recent releases podcast called I'm Thinking of Spoiling Things that I do about once a month now because Reason had a baby, so can't do that very regularly because I can't go to the cinema. But genuinely, so I listened to this podcast for a long time called The Flop House, which is a bad movie podcast. And I was in, of all places, the Facebook group talking about it and just bumped into Jack in the Facebook group and chatted with him there a few times. Learned that we were both in Manchester, joined like a Discord server, and then became friends for a Discord server. Then we started doing an annual, because it started as just an awards show. So it started as just an annual awards show. And then we like doing this. We like talking about films and just, spiraled out from there to let's just pick seasons and topics and talk about them for a while.
That's awesome. That's so cool. The internet can be a really beautiful place where you can actually find, cool, like-minded people with similar interests who then become friends, podcast co-hosts.
Yeah, I mean, he was at my wedding. There's that thing of being like, you meet this random guy in a Flophouse Facebook group, and a few years later, there he is. It's your wedding.
Yeah,
so
that's
bizarre.
That's amazing. That's so cool. For all that's spoken about the internet being a terrible, vile place, we should remember that, it definitely is that, but we should also remember that it serves a lot of really cool purposes. And we can make lifelong friends, like you and Jack, which is awesome. So you guys figured out that you were sort of like-minded in your movie taste, and it just sort of blossomed from there.
Yeah, a lot of interesting overlaps. We're both kind of like omnivorous in our cinematic tastes have seen a lot of the snooty art house stuff, but just like massive genre fans, both huge horror fans, huge like kaiju fans, both mainlining Gamera movies and Godzilla movies. Have seen all of those, etc., etc. So he's, I guess, pushes more into the kung fu side than I do in his expertise, but we have a lot of our fringe interests aligned quite nicely, which is where you want to have those fun film conversations, really.
Would you say that you're more of just like a massive film fan? Are you like a film historian? Are you professionally in the space, or is this really just like a hobby for you?
I think my primary interest is contextualizing, which I've worked out over time. I get laughed at by my co-host on the Spoiling Things podcast. If we're covering a film, I will go back and try and just watch all of that director's film for no real reason, and it's barely even mentioned. But I will so we were. And even for talking about La Chimera, the Alice Raface movie with Brian Loomis on that podcast, I made sure I'm going to watch all of her other movies before that for no real reason. So I really like the historicism element of going back and finding out and finding patterns across history in that kind of like structuralist, formalist way of film is a repetitive language over time. And I have a background in teaching and have taught film only at like high school level. So my interest is more analytical and contextualizing in that way, I guess.
So you're approaching this from a more like academic sense, as opposed to someone like me who's just like, I'm a guy who likes movies.
That's going to set up an expectation that I'm not going to live up to. I think in theory, yes, but most of the time I'm just like, that movie's rad because of this reason. Accessible academics, I would like to say, is the hope.
A more academic background than maybe what I'm approaching it with, which I think will be interesting for a movie like this, because it does really sit within an interesting historical context. Both everything that came out around it, things that came before it, things that have come since this movie. And it's not necessarily something that you like immediately think about as existing within a very particular like context of movie history. But once I watched it and was able to like sit with it, I sort of was able to understand, why the movie would be considered essential by, those at Screen Age Wasteland who were voting on it when we were like initially putting this together.
Yeah, it's a really pivotal film. I mean, it sits with a couple in the conversation, obviously, but it is that really interesting, and we'll talk about this later, of it is so clearly has the the language of Hollywood going backwards. There is
Hmm.
a very much, and Newman is there representing that to a great degree, but the more rose tinted hangout vibe of the film. But then there is this foreshadowed harsh turn, but there is a harsh
Hmm.
turn in it. There's also some exploitation language from the beginning. There's the guy with no eyes that is pseudo deliverance. Have you seen Spielberg's movie Duel? His truck
No,
movie.
I've
Duel
not.
is so awesome. It's just Jaws, but without a shark. It's a truck, and I was just reminded of that so much. Of just
Yeah.
the way that man is shot is like the truck and its driver is shot. It's like he is there as a pseudo kind of like slasher villain in this
Oh yeah.
otherwise quite ruminatory movie of like it's quite cerebral and chilled out, and that guy is just weirdly pure symbolic evil. So it's got these
Yeah.
weird exploitation edges, pre-exploitation or
Hmm.
pre-mainstreamification of exploitation, because you've got B movies. I think this is the same year that like Spider Baby came out, which is such an important film for the horror genre. Of it splits the monster movie and the slasher and is the proto slasher. So we're at this weird kind of genre solidifying point in Hollywood.
Yeah.
World cinema is doing a different thing, but yeah, Hollywood is so interesting right now, and Cool Hand Luke is one of the pivotal films in that, for me at least.
Yeah. Okay. So you brought up something that I definitely want to talk about later, but sort of I'm interested to hear what your take on this movie is and just like the state of American cinema at this point in time as a non-American, because I
Mm,
think for us as Americans, like we think of like the history of cinema as like basically just being like Hollywood and American cinema, and like maybe you sprinkle in a few international movies here and there. I don't know if that's necessarily the same uh for someone in the UK, or for other film fans, maybe internationally outside of the US. But within the US we have a very um you know just we we fail to see anything outside
mm.
of the US as like having significance within world history and cinema history. uh so I'm interested to see if you have like any different thoughts on
So,
how all that plays
this
out.
is from memory, so maybe incorrect. So listener, I may be wrong here, but I think it's interesting to look at this film in regards to key international films that came out this year, because there are some, and it kind of shows a different picture across. So you've got Godard's Weekend, that I think is this year, which is like not the beginning of his new wave output. It's kind of like deeper into it, and is a very kind of interesting, different kind of film. This is also Young Girls Rochefort year, I think, as well. It's one of my absolutely favourite films. Which again, you've got the French New Wave doing absolutely wild, wonderful, brilliant musicals. This is also Belle de Jour. So you've got Buñuel doing that, very, very different what you've got in America. And this is the year of Ken Loach's first film, Poor Cow. So you've got the beginning of like British socio-realism. And it's fascinating to me that all those films seem quite stereotypical of what we think of those cinemas. Oh, you've got your
Hmm.
Godard, you've got your Buñuel's like kind of like pseudo sexy psychological movie over there. You've got the kitchen sink realism of Ken Loach, which he was from the very, very beginning, and he's diverged a little bit, and he's not good now, obviously. No, actually, that's a bit mean. Some of his recent films have been absolutely fantastic, but his last film was not great. So watching Cool Hand Luke from a British point of view, it feels very, when I think of American cinema, I think of this kind of
Yeah.
thing. And it amused me that when I looked at the world cinema that I've seen at this point, I'm like, oh yeah, it seems that every country is, maybe it's because of this is when media becomes more proliferate and is seen more. And
Hmm.
film is becoming more established in that everyone is seeing it across cultural bounds kind of way. It is more accessible. So
Hmm.
maybe that's when our grammar of what we expect certain cinemas to feel like, look like, and it's still the lived memory of those who are the older generation that passed down. But it seems like a solidifying of filmic language or filmic expectation across cultural boundaries, if that makes any sense at all.
I absolutely adore the greater context that you are bringing to this conversation, which is something that I totally do not have within me. I cannot reach the depths of of just like rattling off what was happening, across
You've also got a
European
Gamera movie this year.
filmmaking.
You've got Yongari. You've got the more weird kaiju films. Good year.
You're pulling from a bag that I don't have access to,
Yeah.
and I absolutely adore it. Um, okay, so let's take a step back and let's get into Cool Hand Luke a bit more. But let's
Hmm.
start with a very basic sort of question. I just want to know for you sort of like what your relationship is to this movie. When did you first see it? What have your thoughts about it been? What does this movie like mean to you specifically?
Hmm.
And not necessarily like what does it mean for the larger history of cinema? So I know that I threw a lot of questions at you, but try to answer all of
No,
them.
they relate to the same one because this movie, weirdly, not because of the film itself, but does mean a lot to me because of how I came across it. And you put a list in this Discord of films, and I was like, I love that one, I love that one. I was like, actually, this one, if I was going to talk about one, this one. And it's not because I'm a massive fan of it. It's not one of my favourite films. I think it's great, but I'm not overly enamoured by it. I'm not going to label it 5 stars and put whatever. I think it's a great movie. But I first came across it in university when I was doing a module called The Philosophy of Film. Um,
Hmm.
and being the nerd that I am, they gave us a watching list, and I just watched everything on the watch list. No one else did. Everyone just sat there and just talked about whatever. And the conversation this film came up in was the tutor was talking, and we were talking about what does it mean, the philosophy of film. And her question was, what do you think is the most philosophical film? Which is such an interesting question and so hard to answer on the
Hmm.
spot. And
Yeah.
because she had prepared, she said, well, often Cool Hand Luke is cited as the most philosophical film. And I was like, wow, I've even heard of this movie, right? It's the most. So I went and watched it with that angle, and she went around and asked us what we would say. I gave a terrible answer that I would not repeat here because it would make me look terrible. It was based on what I'd seen. It was literally a film I'd watched that week. So I was mentioned, I think this, and she was like, "That's an interesting." I was like, "That was a bad answer."
All right,
Um,
give the answer.
I'm not saying it.
This is a judgment-free zone.
No, because it's from an awful human being as well. It's not not a very good film. It's from a terrible human being. Um,
Now you have to say it.
I Heart Huckabees was a film I'd literally watched that week that literally talks, because I was not very good then, maybe I'm not even now, of separating this film talks about this thing very literally with this one's
Mhm.
about this thing. There are some very on the nose conversations of Cool Hand Luke that are philosophical, but I
Mhm.
Heart Huckabees is very much the characters mention existentialism every third
Yeah.
word. So for me, I
Yeah.
was like, that film mentions philosophy every line, so that must be a philosophical
Therefore, it
film.
must be. Yeah, that would be like giving like the Good Place as an answer.
Yeah. But therefore,
I do love Mike Schur. Yeah.
I'm gonna throw the question at you. If you were asked this now of what is, and you don't give me just one answer because that's going to make it bad.
Hmm.
But what are the most philosophical films? Would you say?
The one that jumps out to me right
Okay,
now, and this might be just like such a basic bro answer, but
no, I love it.
one that jumps out to me is, um, holy shit, I just lost it. Stalker.
My number one is from the same director. I'd go for Mirror. If someone asked
Yeah,
me that now, I would say Mirror. And I
I haven't
generally
seen Mirror, but yeah.
we could listen to that What a Picture podcast. We talk about it, but yeah, Mirror Tarkovsky's best for me. I mean, Stalker is an absolutely phenomenal movie. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, Mirror is that. I think maybe Bellatar's Verkmaster Harmonies is another one that I would pull for. Persona, Three Women,
Oh,
Antonioni's The
Persona's great.
Passenger. It's
Yeah.
I think now it's just like the Eastern Europe block of just like
Hmm.
60s, 70s existential stuff and
Yeah, they
beyond.
were doing some crazy stuff there, and some of those movies are in the canon,
Mm.
some are not. But it is interesting to think about those versus like something like Cool Hand Luke, which again for like an American audience, like definitely can be up there in terms of most philosophical movie
Mm.
ever made. Um, okay, let's get back to your first time seeing it and like your history background
Um,
with the movies. So the professor gave this as the
yeah,
example
yeah.
for most philosophical movie ever made, or whatever the question was.
Yeah. So, and I'll be honest, my main thing watching it, I was mainly distracted by. I mean, one, you cannot not talk about the egg scene. Was about eggs later. You mentioned Cool Hand Luke, and everyone mentions eggs, but I was mainly distracted by one speech in his film, and me going, "Oh, that's where that's from," which I'm intrigued. Was because I don't know your kind of like musical interests, but was
Hmm.
there any moment in this film where you heard a extract of dialogue and you went, "Wait, what?"
Okay, so not while I was watching the movie, but I did try to do some preparation for the episode, and I came across what song or album uses this, and I must say I have never been the biggest Guns N' Roses fan, so it was it was not something that came that I had ever come across, in my adolescence or formative years when I was like finding out what kind of music
Yeah.
I dug. Guns N' Roses was like never for me. I had totally missed missed that boat.
I had an older brother that was massive into Guns N' Roses, so therefore I, by default, was also in like kind of like early teens, and Civil
Yeah.
War of Use Your Illusion or of The Greatest Hits was where I first came across it, and had heard that song so much and being like, that's where that speech from the beginning of Civil War is from, and that was my main take of this film. Be like, oh, that's the Guns N'
Yeah.
Roses song. That's the
Yeah.
that's where that speech comes from. And in retrospect, very wild that it's in that song. This film is not about Civil War at all. It's not what that's about. But hey,
No. I guess an argument could be made that it is, but I think you would really be stretching to make that argument.
dare I say, Axl Rose is not thinking in that kind of way.
Yeah. Okay, so you'd watched it while you were in school. You come across that scene and you're like, oh, that's the Guns N' Roses song.
Okay.
Were there any other sort of major takeaways from the first time watching it, or was that like the big one?
Yeah, I think it was. I enjoyed it. The egg scene is great. I understand that it is, increasingly philosophical, but it was just parked away as a movie that I watched and thought was great. And I'd not seen that much of the contextual films around it at that point, so it didn't mean that much to me as like a moment in cinema and Hollywood cinema. But it was very memorable to me in this was brought up at a reading list, and was this reason, and this is an important film for that reason, and has a fun sample in it. I watched it with some friends, and we all kind of enjoyed it. It was like, oh, there you go, we watched a classic, we feel good about ourselves. It was always a good thing.
That's classic college or university, as you would say across the pond.
I would.
So, how many times have you revisited Cool Hand Luke since? Have your thoughts about the movie sort of changed or evolved over those subsequent viewings? And like, where do you stand on the movie sort of today?
This is the first time I've watched it since then. So it's been a long time. I'll not reveal how long, but it's been a long time. And I was then a bit worried of like, what happens if I merely think it's okay and I have to come on here and talk about how it's important. But luckily, I do think it's absolutely great. So that is fortunate. So yeah, there's big gulf of time between, and I think it was nice to watch it there as it was presented to me as canonical text for this reason, and now I feel I'm treating it as canonical text for a different reason, and it's nice to view it in those lenses of, rather than me looking like panning it for philosophy, being like, where's all the philosophy in this movie?
Yeah.
And now I'm watching it as, why is this important as film? Which are two different lenses, and how you approach a film is going to very much determine what you take away from it at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is an interesting thing about what we're able to do on this show in particular, is like rethink how we're watching movies and watching it with the question of like, what is it that makes this movie important? What is it that makes this movie essential? Why would you give this movie to someone who is just starting out their sort of film fandom and trying to like get a greater understanding for the films that have influenced, film in general, culture at large, and sort of all of those things? What would you say like stands out to you in that regard for this movie?
I think the prison movie is enduringly popular, or is just one of the staple genres, and this is a key one of those, and it's quite an archetypal one of those in the modern language of the prison movie. The more popular and more populist prison movies that I'm sure I'll allude to later just lift direct scenes from this, or visual moments. We mentioned before the podcast recording that, I mean, not directly a prison movie, but with the prison logic. So Cuckoo's Nest, though based on a book, I don't know when, I have read the book, but I don't know when the writing of the book lines up to, because this is also based on a book, but I've not read that either. So Cuckoo's Nest feels like it's this, but in an institution, as opposed to in a prison, which is a different institution. You know what I mean? And then Shawshank literally just takes a few shots from this movie and the sweaty dude's vibe of this film, and just transposes it in a different way, again based on literature. So it's got the prison thing going for it. It also has the star vehicle of Paul Newman is a star, and it expects you to know him as a star, and for that to do a performance. And that's a specific kind of filmmaking that you need to realize is a kind of filmmaking to appreciate so much of American film, though not only American film. And it is a film that is trying to be in dialogue with the state of the country at the time, for good or for bad. And it is a film very much trying to engage in, I think, quite perennial elements of the human condition. And also, I would say, literary history and literary theory history, which is therefore applied to film, has taught us that anything that has a whole bunch of Christian symbolism in it is going to be taken very, very seriously.
Yeah, that's okay. I think I want to. You brought up like a few really good points. I think I want to circle back to sort of the prison movie aspect, as well as the connection to Cuckoo's Nest, which was, funnily enough, that was the premiere episode for season 3
There you
of
go.
this show.
You need to find another move that's just like that to open season 5.
Exactly. Yeah, I should have saved Shawshank for
I
season
need to
5.
do the ninth configuration.
That's it's not in our list.
I mean, I would be very surprised if it was. But, great movie.
So yeah, we have the prison movie. I think also the idea of like making movies with movie stars as being like a type of filmmaking that we need to like understand is a very specific kind of filmmaking, and definitely something that is extremely critical to understanding the history of American cinema and like Hollywood in general.
Yeah, as a legacy of the studio system, where a studio, I mean, owned is too loaded a term, but have contracts with stars, and this is our star, and therefore appears in our films. It's a very different way of films, not even just made, but are consumed, and it's supposed to be.
It's a conversation that comes up a lot in 2024 when talking about the state of American cinema and like theaters dying, and it's
where
because
are all the movie stars?
We don't have movie stars. So it will be interesting to talk about that and like how this movie is very much so aware that it is a movie centered around a movie star, and like that is the big draw of it, and knowing how to make a movie around a movie star as opposed to like auteur driven cinema with that boom sort of comes after this, and this is one of the movies that we can say sort of like ushers in that age of auteur driven cinema with like the what are they called, the movie brats or the film brats or whatever. With
so this is the cusp of new Hollywood, of the new Hollywood movement, and not quite.
The other thing that you brought up that was great was the anything in literature or like media that is a Christ allegory is like immediately seen as like, okay, that's important and good, and we need to appreciate that. And I don't know that that's necessarily always true, because it is like the Christ story is maybe the most derivative form of storytelling that we have.
Oh yeah, no, I agree.
So we'll get into that a little bit and how
I just feel it's more that so much of literary theory is rooted genuinely in the King James Bible, of like literal biblical interpretation is the father figure of when we interpret text, it comes from having to interpret the allegorical text of the Bible as a way, and therefore the academic language around film comes to the academic language around literature, so is still so arguably infected with the language of the religious. This is, I think, also the same year as Mouchette, the Bresson film, which this film I would link to Bresson's As a Balthazar, which is again a Christ allegory, but they're like Christ as donkey rather than that. But again, this story of the punished figure at the center of being a martyr and being that holds up is an interesting cinematic mode. And that makes, again, Cool Hand Luke quite vital, because this is one of the stories we like to tell in cinema. And this is one of the key versions of that story of here is the rebel at the center, but it's also the punished figure that can be the martyr and can be the beacon for salvation.
All right, well, since we're here, let's talk a little bit more about this sort of the stand-in Christ figure, and also the rebellious figure at the center, who we sort of like don't understand exactly what motivates them to rebel, but they just like have it within them to rebel. And very much so like Cuckoo's Nest, it's about a character at the center who is meant to tell us that our individualism is so much more important and so much stronger than the punitive authority that exists as like the state at large, or in this movie, the prison system in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the mental institution that they're in, as sort of like stand-ins for authority and the state. And like, how do those two, because Christ as a figure isn't like necessarily like that. We're not interested in his individualism in that story. Many of the stories that use the Christ story as an allegory like are interested in that, like Cool Hand Luke.
I need to check it. I'm very quickly checking like when another film came out because I'm going to be absolutely wild if it's the same year as well. So it might be. But the Melville, yeah, 96.7 again. Jesus Christ, good year.
Yeah,
But
great year.
Melville's Le Samurai, which is again this. There is this fascination. I like Le Samurai. I don't love Le Samurai. I am a big Melville fan. I think Melville's absolutely
Mhm.
fantastic, but it's not one of his best for me. Army of Shadows is by far his best for me. But Le Samurai is that picture of locked off masculinity as this very aspirational thing of looking cool and acting cool. And you're right, there is this fetishization of it wants to be a film about the way a man acts is more important. It says that a few times, and it does have that to it. But there is
Mhm.
also this idea of the closed off, taciturn man is the man to be, and there is something existential about the kind of like Bob Dylan esque kind of like punk poet of slightly left of the establishment, but also still very much the establishment.
Mhm.
Um, I think you're really on something with the psychological space that Luke has in this film. Of he is more interesting for we don't actually know much about him, and that is
Mhm.
obviously meant to map on. But then there is definitely the clear Jesus stuff, which is so the beginning, the random act of vandalism. One can make a link to the pushing over the tables. There is that kind of like act that gets into trouble. There is the ridiculous but wonderful shot of post egg crucifixion. Um,
that that might be one of the like
funniest shots in film ever
funniest.
made.
Yeah, like, but also like it kind of
It's
works.
great. Oh, it's so
It
great.
works. It works for this movie because you're
It's
like,
so
okay,
Scorsese, isn't it? It's so
yeah, we're zooming out, and you see the right arm, and the angle that it's at, and you're like, okay, we're doing Jesus pose here, and then it
post
pulls
egg
out to see
cheese.
his feet, and it's like, oh, we're doing like full on crucifixion pose, and we're doing it post egg scene,
Yeah.
which is like so hysterical that like that is like
That's
his
his.
way of dying for our sins is eating 50 eggs. Like that's hilarious, but
It is.
also
It's awesome though.
w-
It's super
yeah,
awesome.
within the context of this movie, it's rad. Like, okay,
It's
great. Like I get it. I understand what we're doing here. I'm down.
But you also have the kind of like reverse feeding of the 5,000 bit towards the end of when he gets given
Hmm.
far too much rice and they all like come up and they take a bit of rice from him. Is that's
Hmm.
a so overtly Christ-like moment. And then the acceptance of his own death in the church at the end, so then he can get that final
Hmm.
victory is again so overtly Christ-like. But it is so very interesting to take the cult of the rebellious individual and to map that to Christ. It definitely
Hmm.
matches a national psychology at that point because I agree, personal politics will dampen a tiny bit, but I'm very much in line with the anti-authoritarian stance of this film. It
Hmm.
definitely has a good view of the prison system. The racial optics are interesting,
Hmm.
relatively unchallenged bar a couple. There's one very interesting line where a prison guard says they've never shot a white man before, which is such an interesting
A white
kind of
person. Yeah.
it's such a peek into oh yeah this is happening during the civil rights movement and that's kind of like not mentioned but then the not
Yeah.
mentioning of that becomes interesting to the film and there is
Because
that
it's just like hanging there in the background, and
yeah
this movie doesn't need to get into that at
no
all. Like, right, that's not the point of this movie. But it is interesting that line is there. So then it's just like for the rest of the movie, you're sort of thinking about that other thing, that other context, right, of American
mm.
history, like hovering over the background of the movie.
Which I love about the film because I think it's because it does engage with the image of a chain gang so frequently, and I think the film is
Hmm.
very aware that if the usual association, if described, is not what the film is showing, and the film is almost very guilty of being ignorant and placing certain perspectives and ignorant perspectives, but then does a great job of letting you know, no, it is not that. It is aware
Hmm.
of this, and it lets you bring that into the film as opposed to dealing with
Hmm.
it, which I think is a very smart way of doing that. And I do love his interaction with the two black kids later in the film, which I think there is flaws with that moment, but shows that the filmmakers have an interest in opening up to the wider scope of America, and there is a broader America, it being set in the South in this period and being about
Hmm.
incarceration. Um, is cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think it's cool that, right, like not every movie needs to be explicitly about every
Mm.
single thing, and we can apply different our like own understandings of sort of what's happening within the background of a movie to then like, apply different understandings of it. But you can also, if you want to just like completely ignore that aspect of the movie or like that like historical context saying within the background, you very much so can do that and still enjoy this movie for everything else that is, happening on screen or, slightly beneath the surface or whatever it may be.
Would you argue the film is individualist or collectivist?
It's really interesting. I was thinking about that within the context of like the Christ allegory, because I think with it, right, like this movie sits within a really interesting time in American history where, right, you sort of have like the beatnik movement. We're starting to get into like Vietnam War, like counterculture sort of things, right? But so many of the great texts that are coming out around this time that are sort of dealing with that, i.e. this and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, are about figures that are stand-ins for Christ and like the American public's interest in Christianity and like Christianity as a very American identity, while also trying to like buck up against the collective, which does include like most people being Christian, is very, it's an interesting sort of like struggle that the movie is dealing with and like trying to be both things at once. So I think that there is kind of I think that there is an interest in individualism. I don't think it necessarily goes there the same way that like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest does, because we're not made to understand the rest of the prisoners as individuals. It's like really only Luke who's given, who's given the benefit of that. So it is kind of hard to put a finger on where exactly the movie sits in that regard. I don't know what you think, if you have thoughts about it skewing one way or the other.
I think it's very, very interesting, because I think I don't know if it particularly knows, nor is it that interested. I think it realizes that Luke, through way of Paul Newman, is this magnetic, inspirational presence, and I think it wants to reckon with what that means. And at no point does it show, oh, collective action is better, but there is this undercurrent of, if they were like this and did the things that he did, there would be a kind of victory there. Because it's the last, I think he does it more through the inverse. So when he is isolated and pushed down, he is able to be like defeated. It's really depressing. The last third of this film, when he is just being downtrodden by the state, is such a great show to me of the weakness of the individual. We have him raised up as, look at this guy, what a guy. And because they view him as symbol more than person, there's that line towards the end. I forget the exact line, but it's like, you're all feeding off of me. So I think there is a strong criticism of, we should look to for inspiration, but we should then not just package them as inspiration. And if the film has a statement, I think it's more that. And that's why he does have to die at the end. And the hope is that they can more live as him rather than live through him.
Yeah, I dig that reading. I hadn't reached it myself, but I appreciate what you're putting down there. Okay, let's step away from some of these more existential, philosophical questions, and let's talk about the fun stuff. We mentioned it, but what do you have on the egg scene?
The egg scene is absolutely fantastic. The egg scene is brilliant. And it's also part of, this is cinematically a really engaging film. I'm amused, was amused revisiting this film, that it starts so montage style of like violation, and then this like strange font of the credits of like cool handling. I'm like, this is not, I had this pegged very differently in my mind, because it does have moments of silliness and of just strange atypical filmmaking. But yeah, the claim that he can eat 50 eggs, and it is so similar to the Cuckoo's Nest scene when he says, I can lift up this the water fountain, and I'm going to do it for the sake of it. But it's like, what if he gets to win this time? It's the Rambo 2, do we get to win this time? Which actually, maybe that's like Rambo 3 actually, but there is a Rambo, a First Bloodness to this film, of it's about what happens when the soldier comes home, and what does that mean to fit back into society post being a soldier and seeing so much, which I that it keeps on the fringe, but there's such a part of the psychology of all of these characters.
that's again hovering in the background of this movie, and like everything that's happening, within it is is that that question of like, what does this mean for soldiers when they come back from war, and like the state that they're in, and sort of like our obligation to them as a society to make sure that they can thrive the way that we sort of want them to. Yeah, that was really interesting, that's just, in the background and never really like fully explored, but you can infer some things
It,
about.
it's the best place to leave it. I think it does well to the movie. But anyway, the fun eggs. So he just makes this claim that he can eat 50 eggs, which is such a great, I'm going to do this for the sake of this. And this is a thing that I'm going to say. And I love the framing that it's not about doing it. It's about the spectacle of the thing. And I think it works because it's a fun scene and it's silly. And it's a fun scene of man eats 50 eggs, and it's a show of physical endurance. And it well conveys, and it's a bit of microcosm of the film, of this scene starts out fun, then gets pretty serious and gets a bit alarming, and then ends up being like, okay, that's fine. And that is the arc of the film as a whole. So it's a great, this is the film in one scene of it. But it's also does link into the more philosophical themes, because it shows how money obsessed they are in this literal microcosmic society where money means nothing. They should be outside of, they are not engaging in commerce in the way that we engage in commerce, yet capital in this way means so much to them. And there's that great line that literally all the money in the prison, because they're like, bet more, it's like, no, literally every bit of money in this prison, in this microeconomy, we have finite stuff, and it's all on this. But they're just doing it for the sake of it, because of the psychological meaning of money means something to me, and the act of purchase means something to me, so therefore it must mean something here, even though it's the theatre of economics shown, and our obsession with economics put in this circus spectacle of I'm going to eat 50 eggs is really, really good.
That's the line that like that fully motivates him to, go the final mile. It seemed like he was going to tap out, and then he hears that all the money's on the line, and he's like, well, now I got to do it.
All the money.
Yeah. So yeah, like, is it a motivation of, I just want to do this thing because I can show that I can do this thing, or are there some other things that are at play here? One of the other scenes that I wanted to ask you about, just to sort of get your thoughts on, because in the prep that I did, I saw that there were a few different maybe not readings, but thoughts about the necessity of the scene. What did you think about the scene with Luke and his mom?
I think it's really, really interesting. I think that necessity is so fascinating to be in that conversation. I feel there is a strain of criticism that reads things as being purely narrative function. And I feel there's so much more that a film can do than narrative. And to be a bit of a side, it's part of the weird sex scene discourse at the moment of films can do so many more things than just tell you a story. And also stories are told in lots of different ways. And when you're building character and setting, that is part of the wider narrative function of film. And for a character that's so closed off to us, for this to see the way that he interacts with someone outside of an institutionalized setting is so important to get that dynamic. To see how he speaks to his mum, and to see his mum, and the more wistful film scenes, that themes the film are in here. But one of the most important lines of the film is in this bit, which is when his mum, and a lot of the film's got on the nose, but I like that it's on the nose, makes that statement about wishing that humans were like dogs, and just not having it. It's this view of life without forced attachment. And this as a prison film is about a sense of forced attachment, of they've got to adopt a micro society, and they do, and that's why it's a psychologically interesting film. And then later in the film, you see the attack dogs, and there's some animal cruelty in this film that absolutely sucks. It's really hard to watch, but a thematically interesting scene is that dog that just pushes itself through that fence, which as a setup of filming is grotesque, but as a thematic beat to link back to that conversation of, there is this want to be the more simple animal. It's that Jeremy Bentham idea of, is it better to be the dissatisfied human or the satisfied pig? Of, is it better to have lowered capabilities and not realize the weight of being alive? And I think the film, through this scene, does a good job of showing there is this want under the weight of the world to forsake it all and live much more simply, and give up the parts that make us feel pain, that are very, very human. But the animal life, and so many animals are just shot in this movie for that reason, but the animal life is actually crueler and harsher, and that's our way to live. And yeah,
Yeah.
which I think is not really addressing your question, but I really like this scene as it shows a different side of Luke. It's one
Mhm.
of the more positive feminine parts of the film, which has
Mhm.
an otherwise not that great relationship with femininity, which would be fine if there wasn't a scene earlier which just is very, very negative about that. There's an earlier scene that I would just kick out of the movie.
Yeah.
I know, what do you think?
I did appreciate the scene with the mom. I think a lot of the criticism that I did see about this particular scene was that it does give us too much insight into Luke and who he is and what makes him tick. And I think a lot of people would prefer the movie to sort of leave him as more of a blank slate where
It's
we
like the
can just
samurai crowd again. It's like the
project.
samurai crowd that just wants
Yeah, we
these closed off men that they can
yeah
apply
we
themselves
can
to.
project whatever it
Oh,
is that
I
we
don't like
want
it.
to project onto the character. It doesn't and then some of the criticisms were that it doesn't add anything to like our understanding of Luke, which I think is totally fine. I agree with you that not every scene within a movie needs to be there for the purpose of like narrative progression. I think a lot of times like we are watching movies for like emotional understandings and things like that. And if a scene is there to further thematic elements, emotional elements, or like emotional connection to not even like the characters within the movie, but just like the world around us, right? Like I think that's why
Mm.
a big reason why I watch movies is to like just gain like a better understanding of the world around me. And if a scene is doing that, whether or not it directly impacts like the narrative going forward is fine if it's all in furtherance of that same like a consistent emotional
Mm.
understanding, like right, like don't just like throw in scenes that are that are scatter place emotions for me to just like be overloaded
Yeah, it's not
or
manipulative in that way. It's
overwhelmed.
not just like, and here's
Yeah.
an extra theme. I think in a film that is so constrained in location, it's important to have one scene that lets in the outside world. And I like the
Mhm.
symbolic framing of the outside world put in a wagon in that kind of way, and that the back of that van that she's in is set up like a kind of like bedroom, like a more an area of pseudo luxury they don't have access to. So is this entering of a different world you can be a part of? But that idea of supposedly ancillary seeds. I mean, you'll have seen Fargo, right?
Mhm.
So the scene that is so oft cited in Fargo as being pointless is to me the scene of the film, which is when she goes to I think it's like Twin Cities and meets up with like Mikey Yanagita and just has
Oh
that
yeah, yeah, yeah,
random
yeah.
meal with him. And I've
Yeah.
talked to so many friends and they're just like, love Fargo. What's that scene about? I'm like, that scene is the one time when she realizes the capacity for humans to just lie and be deceitful and to
Mhm.
not conform to what she sees humanity as being. And that is so key for that character. And I do
Yeah.
think this is key for Cool Hand Luke. We do need to know that he is not just this messiah figure, that he is a bit
Mhm.
of a screw up, that he has made mistakes and there is regret around him, and that he has been able to blank slate himself in this prison, that he has
Mhm.
invented himself in the prison, and that
Yeah.
we need to confront that Cool Hand Luke is an invention of the prison state that is not that character. And this scene allows us to do that.
That's so interesting, right? Like he's not Cool Hand Luke with his mom.
Yeah.
He's Luke the screw up who,
Yeah.
did not live up to it to his full potential.
Because he is.
Uh, yeah. I also think it's interesting within that scene that there's a slight glimpse into another character and like his interaction with his mom, where she's like trying to like rustle his hair and he's kind of resistant to it. And just
Yeah.
like having like one moment where we understand that like, oh yeah, these men, do come from,
Yeah.
family systems, whatever they may be. They might be different, but there is like there is a world for them outside of this prison that in some ways like led them to, be in this prison or become whatever character it is that we see within the, you know, within the plotting of this movie, whether it be Luke or
Yeah.
someone else. So I thought the scene was great. Um, I thought it was a great, sort of detour from
Yeah.
just like seeing Luke be the coolest guy ever.
But it's projectical, isn't it? He is made to be cool by the guys around him, and I think that's where the film is interesting. Of they
Hmm.
project a cool onto him, and they even coin the "cool hand Luke" phrase of that wonderful poker scene where
Yeah.
he wins by doing nothing, and that's again so symbolically important. Of he didn't, and that goes back to what's about the thesis statement of there's nothing that Luke does that they cannot do. It's just the way that he lives his life, and that's why he's an interesting aspirational figure, because he is. So I saw a new movie at the cinema today, which I thought was okay. It's one of these new Pixar movies, and one of the depressing things about it is it gets this point at the end of about inner love, but inner love being dependent on, and you've got high grades and you're great at hockey, and there's idea of so many characters in films needs to be exceptional to be worthy of the audience's interest, and Luke isn't exceptional, genuinely isn't, apart from he's just quite a magnetic personality, and
he's hot.
Yeah, he's hot. He is the of the sweaty dudes. He's the hottest sweaty dude, and that attraction point is really important. But yeah, he is not aspirational in terms of his faculties.
It's also almost like they like push him to be the sort of messiah figure. Like he doesn't like have that within him. He sort of internalizes everything that they project onto him. They're like, "Oh, Luke, you're so cool," with the boxing stuff. And
you lost the boxing so bad. It's so good, Luke. You're so bad at boxing.
You ate all the eggs, and you were bluffing about your hand in poker. Like, dude, you're the man. And then he's like, you know what? Maybe I am the man, and maybe I'm the one who will escape from this prison. And time after time, it's proven that, like, no, he's not the one to actually escape from the prison. So, like, maybe they were just blowing all the smoke up his ass, and he kind of, I don't know if this is necessarily, like, the intended reading of the movie, but, like, it just got to the point where he started, believing that his shit didn't stink.
I think it goes back to a thing that you commented on so brilliant earlier of the American obsession with finding a new Jesus. There is that sense of the want for a Messiah is so personal to this film. They are all just in search for something, and I think why film is so obsessed with it. If you've got media as like new religious force, the religiosity of media of looking for the Christ figure, and they need that from him. But to go to the escape attempts, that goes back to the mother scene, because the escape is so interesting because everyone seems to be getting on fine, and I usually don't like prison films where they're not actually oppressed, because prisons are inherently oppressive places. I have visited a prison once because a close family member was incarcerated, and I visited them in prison once, and it was just the feel of being in that place was just horrendous. And this was only being in like the visiting booth, and that same family member was in. So I'm from Reading. I don't live there anymore, so I'm not doxing myself. That same family member was in Reading jail, just before it closed. And Reading jail is most famous for being that place where Oscar Wilde was imprisoned, which was hilarious growing up. Very depressing. They had a blue plaque outside saying Oscar Wilde was here. It's like, yeah, but for being gay, you probably should have a blue plaque about that. That's really messed up. It's not good that he was here.
Come visit our prison.
Come visit our prison where we locked up a man for being homosexual. I'm like, no, that did happen, but that wasn't a great thing. But they then opened up that prison for an exhibition, an Oscar Wilde exhibition. And again, it was just being in that space is so hard to describe, because it's just through no force. There's no guards, it's not a prison anymore, but it's just inherently oppressive. And part of this film is hangout coolness. And then his mother dies, and they make a judgment about him of, we should lock you up in case you escape. And then he starts trying to escape. It's that way of, because to get wankily philosophical, and I apologize, but the Rousseauian social contract. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau is one of these kind of like one of the many philosophers who talks about the natural state of man, what that means. And he has this idea of the social contract of, we may not actively think we've agreed to live in society, but we all live in accordance with certain things. We tacitly consent to being societalized. And it feels at that point that the prisoners have this social contract together, and the guards have just broken it. And that's what breaks it for him of, we live by these societal rules, and you have just asserted your authority and seen me as this person, and that they make him that person is absolutely brilliant, of locking him up because they think he would escape, and then he starts escaping, and that's when they've lost, when they go into actual oppression.
That is super interesting. The idea that the guards and the authority figures are the ones who unnecessarily sort of like rip up that contract. That otherwise like was sort of like, we could have gone on for another hour of this movie just being about, everyone in the prison.
Having a fun time in prison, it's having a fun time eating 50 eggs in prison.
Yeah, dudes eating 50 eggs, boxing,
Yeah,
playing poker,
getting
uh,
sweaty outside,
getting sweaty outside,
grunting
being
together. I mean,
inappropriate.
you're looking at a woman, but you're grunting together.
Yeah, being inappropriate at the one woman that we see. Just like guys being dudes. Like it could have
Yeah.
been another hour of guys being dudes, but unfortunately, the guards decided to tear up that contract and sort of force Luke's hand
His
in a
cool
way
hand.
that, yeah, his cool hand. They forced the cool hand, and they didn't need to do that. So that is a really interesting point. Okay, two quick things that we sort of touched on before that I want us to
Yeah.
quickly talk about before we get into recommendations and get out of here. Uh, Sort of related, but the first one being the idea of like movie star filmmaking being a
Mm.
subset of filmmaking, and this movie is very much so aware that like, okay, you're coming to it with the understanding that Paul Newman is this great figure, this great movie star, very charismatic, very beautiful. We touched on that before,
Mm.
and the movie is like really built around his sort of like magnetism on screen, and without that understanding of filmmaking, like this movie doesn't really work. What are your thoughts on all
I,
that?
I agree, because so much of the film is just him sitting to the side and looking cool. And like one of the pivotal
Mhm.
points is later in the film he does not face to the side and sits straight on, and that being a narrative point comes from the baggage that you have with Paul Newman. And even if you don't know Paul Newman, you recognize him as this is a movie star of the kind
Mhm.
that I am used to. And that is certainly core. And all of the Christ themes and messianic themes go back to this guy's movie star. I will say, him sitting side on playing the banjo um, is so reminiscent of the Muppet movie of Kermit with the banjo doing Rainbow Connection, and that was all I could think of for the entirety of that scene, being like, who does it better, Kermit
Yeah.
or Paul Newman? I think Kermit.
Who's the bigger movie star, Kermit?
I think Kermit is a bigger movie star than Paul Newman. I'm saying it.
He might be. I,
Yeah.
I I don't think you're totally wrong in saying
When is
that.
Muppets Cool Hand Luke going to come out? They can do that.
Yeah, we should do that. We'll use some sort of like AI CG version of Paul Newman to bring him back to
Oh
life.
god, they would. They would as well. Oh god.
Yeah,
Oh no.
yeah. Zaslav, if you're listening, don't actually do that. You,
Hi Dave.
he's a big fan of the show.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, this movie is very much so aware of that. Do you think that another sort of movie star of the time could have also done this? Do you think it's unique to
I
Paul Newman?
No, I
Like,
think they have had some like white dudes aplenty at this point. I think he could be swapped in with many of the men of the time, and it would
yeah,
be functionally the same movie. And that's not to diminish him. I think he is great in this role. I think
mhm,
he is very very good, and it works because of him. But I think it's very telling of the homogeneity of the star system. Of you could swap in the other like four big names, um,
yeah.
and it would
I was
still
reading
work.
something that said that the other big names of the time wouldn't have been able to embody Luke the way that Paul Newman
I
did, but
really think they could.
I just think you put like you said, one of the four uh big movie stars at the time in this role, and it's like kind of the same movie.
Yeah,
But like you said, no disrespect to Paul Newman, like he's absolutely
he's great in
wonderful.
it. He's absolutely great. But
He's wonderful in this. It's maybe it's this time versus like movie stars of like the mid 90s where it wouldn't work. But yeah, like movie star filmmaking is very much so a part of American movie history, and this movie is a prime example of,
mm,
okay, you have a movie that is centered around the idea that we have this one guy
the guy
who
was cool.
who is very cool. Pretty much all Americans know him, and they will go see a movie because he is in it. And the movie might end up being pretty good. Maybe there's some good writing, there's some solid
Yeah,
directing. The camera
will
work
make you think.
is solid. You'll think there's a Christ pose at one point, and you know what that is. So yeah, it's cool. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about a little bit more, to for us to dive a little bit deeper into, is how this is part of like the movement that ushered in New Hollywood. So, right, the other big movies that came out in this year, at least in the States, you have Bonnie and
Yeah,
Clyde,
Bonnie and Clyde
Graduate,
is
which are
such
often
a
seen as
harsher version of this, though, isn't it?
yeah, those are often seen and held up as like the movies that like really ushered in the new Hollywood phase.
Mm,
The Graduate is like often pointed to as like the first version of American like postmodern filmmaking, which then,
yeah.
obviously um, influenced everything up through like Tarantino and everything that was happening, like the indie scene in the 90s. And then Bonnie and Clyde, influencing the likes of like Scorsese and Coppola and all of those guys. But Cool Hand Luke, you know, isn't necessarily always thought of in that regard. But I think when we're thinking about this sort of like very early counterculture kind of
Yes.
filmmaking, that this movie very much so is a part of that. And you can see its influence in, subsequent movies that would come throughout like the late 60s through 70s or whatever.
I think a lot of its grammar in terms of its cinematic language is still quite traditional. And I think that's why it's maybe not kept in conversations of
Hmm.
the flow of it and the background of it. But then there are these more like exploitation edges, and there are bits that flow forward differently. The film that I've thought about a lot while watching this is so Bogdanovich is such a key part of New Hollywood, and his film Last Picture Show is such
Hmm.
a darker, more cynical take on some of the ideas here. Many of the ideas don't relate, but that idea of the microcosm of the small town in that film, but the prison here, and the you come back to a place and it's all washed out and it's depressing. And what does it mean to be a person nowadays, one life? So this feels like that ushering a film that was about to happen, that is
Hmm.
much more negatively coded, but it doesn't quite have the existential cynicism. This
Hmm.
is existentially pointed in a different way and is
Yeah.
more hopeful and more Christ-like rather than
Hmm.
the more, I guess, the continental nihilistic philosophy that will be brought in by the more
Yeah.
philosophical bent of your new Hollywood breed of directors.
But I mean, compared to like sort of what American audiences were used to seeing leading up to it, it is starting to
Mm.
like turn that dial. Obviously, like you can't just like flip the switch
Well, that goes back to the Fuller
immediately
conversation of
with one movie.
Fuller is out there making movies that are much more abrasive, harsh, and like really speaking to the heart of social issues. He is such a socially conscious, engaged filmmaker. But
Hmm.
and those movies all did very, very well because they were moderately budgeted films. But
Hmm.
if we talk about films that move the canon, that move the conversation, this is a key transitional work, and you can almost feel the baton pass in the film of here goes the old way, here comes the new way, and we're bending
Hmm.
towards the more negatively framed, the more questioning, the
Yeah.
more let's think about our assumptions and what is good about this stuff rather than just being straight out heroic. And there are films that have done that all throughout filmic history, but it's
Hmm.
about profile, I think, more than about
Yeah.
examples.
Yeah. Absolutely. Great movie.
Really great
Very
movie.
happy that I finally got around to watching it. Thank you so much for joining for this conversation. Are there any sort of topics or anything that we didn't get to talk through that you want to bring up?
Um, I would mention Harry Dean Stanton because we should always mention Harry Dean Stanton when Harry Dean Stanton appears in
Yes.
a film. And I feel it's a wonderful kind of like counterpoint to there are two different styles of because Harry Dean Stanton is a movie star, but he is a character actor movie star. So such a different kind of movie figure, and he's just
Mhm.
what a filmography, what an interesting dude. And
Yeah.
it's just great to see him. He sings a song. I remember hearing that Harry Dean Stanton is just so taciturn, like especially in interviews, doesn't interview well. There's a hilarious anecdote of
Mhm.
because he was an alien, obviously, and there was an interviewer that wanted to get him talking. So I thought they'd mentioned the sets in Alien, which are legendary for being these like bespoke, amazing sets. So they're like, this
Mhm.
guy's not talking to me. So Harry Dean Stanton, what were the sets like? And he was like, you saw the movie? They were like that. I'm like, thank you, Harry. Okay, great. Um,
What a legend.
it's what
What
you
an
want from
absolute
him. It's what
legend.
you want. So yeah,
Yeah.
R.I.P. Harry Dean Stanton.
Yeah.
What an absolute legend.
Yeah, I was very happy to see him pop up. I was expecting a little bit more just because I was like, oh, it's Harry Dean Stanton.
Yeah.
He's gonna be a big part of this. But yeah, great to see him. And he's one of those people who looked the same age for about 40
Oh
years,
yeah, yeah.
right? He's what I mean, he's got to be pretty young in this movie. Like,
Yeah, he's got to be, but he looks like he's lived a whole life already on his
yeah,
face.
like he looks the same age in like Alien or like Paris,
Yeah,
Texas.
apparently,
So,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
100%.
like wait, that's like it's almost like 20 years before.
But to throw this film across the pond a bit further, I do feel there is a link in terms of its depiction of ennui and desolation to what Antonioni is doing, and it's so different. If you think about The Passenger, you think about Blow Up, you think about L'Avventura, of
Mm-hmm.
the different cultural approaches to ennui and just the disaffection and being not satisfied with modernity would make wonderful kind of like conversational pairing pieces with this film that take that conversation and skew it. And there's like, modern things like Elephant Sitting Still kind of like does that a bit more. But also you've got like Fellini's Il Tony from the time of like boys being boys, men being men, but what if sad
Mm-hmm.
is such a fun genre of what if boys were
Yeah.
boys, but it was a bit sad.
Yeah. We need more of that.
Yeah.
Because sometimes being boys is really just like being sad.
Yeah. Let's be
It's
sad
very much a
together.
part of it. Yeah. That does feel like a good way for us to transition into recommendations, but I don't want to jump the gun there. If there
No,
are any
no.
other
No,
any
I think
ones
I'm
that you
good
like.
because I think I'm about to become very irritating and just list off like 50 films. So I will try and limit myself.
Hell yeah. Sweet. So for recommendations, let's jump into it. For each movie that we introduce into our
Yeah.
canon, we will also recommend 3 things per guest host to check out if you like said movie. The rules for recommendations, you just made me aware of one very important rule. We try to stick to 3 movies or 3 recommendations per person. We've had to serve out penalties and bans and suspensions and all sorts of things in the past for people doing people trying to recommend more than 3 things. So that's one of our rules. The other rules are at least one of the recommendations has to be another movie. The other 2 can also be movies, but it can be any and everything else. It
Yeah.
can be a band, an album, a
It could be
TV
the song
show.
Civil War from Guns N'
Yeah,
Roses.
exactly. It could be
It
a
will not be.
TV show, a season of TV, an episode of TV. Really, really anything. It can be a painting, a restaurant. It could be more movies. For any movies that we do recommend, we just ask that none of them are movies that are already in the canon. So, like we said, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We've already spoken about that. But then obviously no like The Godfather or any of those very obvious choices for movies in the canon. Sometimes it's a guessing game of like this is a great movie that could go either way. It could be in the
Yeah,
canon,
anything.
not be in the canon. So that's always fun. And yeah, we will for each thing that we're recommending, we'll go back and forth. Steven, you'll go first. Give a
Okay.
brief overview for why it is that you're recommending it, what its connection is to Cool Hand Luke, and then I'll go. I'll give my first, and then we'll just go back and forth until we give all 3.
All
So,
right.
with that, what is your first recommendation?
So when people think New Hollywood, a name that comes up a lot is Paul Schrader. So Paul
Mm.
Schrader maybe as writer more than director for the New Hollywood crowd. So Paul Schrader now is very famous for making the same film every time but worse, I would say, is the key thing that he does now, which is such a wonderful thing that he does. But, back in the day, he's writing Taxi Driver, he's directing Mishima, which is a complicated film about a complicated dude, which, but there is a specific Schrader film, and for me, it's by far the best Schrader film. And one of my absolute favorite movies, and I do not think this will be in the canon, that really links to this film for me, is a more depressing film, arguably, but gets that idea of masculinity enforced kind of like pseudo-Taylorist. So there is a Taylorism to this film of the scientific efficiency of work and turning men into a product. And I'm, of course, thinking of Paul Schrader's Blue Collar, which is such a phenomenal movie
Nice.
in terms of unpicking race relations, but is primarily about suppressed man's place in entrenched capitalist society through the institution thereof factory work as opposed to prison work, but is also about the oppressive institutions that bear down on people and people living in those things, and is such a nuanced individual-led film about that goes to depressing realizations about the violence that happens, literalizing the violence of systems by violence on human beings. And I think Blue Collar is still strangely underseen and is one of the most remarkable films that I've seen, and would be a great pairing to Cool Hand Luke.
That's a great recommendation. That's a movie that's been sitting on my watch list for
It's so
quite some
phenomenal.
time.
It's so phenomenal.
Yeah, I've got to get around to watching that. I like that. That's a great first pick. Shout out to Paul Schrader. Okay, I'm gonna go with some really obvious choices
Cool.
for my recommendations. The first one, we obviously spoke about it ad nauseum in this episode, but this is very much so a movie about a regular guy being seen as a Christ figure. And I feel like I've probably recommended this before, but I'm going to recommend it again because it's an amazing movie and it really should be in the canon. But I'm going to recommend a movie about Jesus being seen as a regular guy. So we're going to do the reverse of that,
I
and
know
I'm
where
going
this
to
is going.
recommend The Last Temptation of Christ.
What a great
because
movie. Is that a Schrader
any
script?
chance- it might be,
I think
but
it might be. I'm going to sound stupid if I'm wrong. Let's just claim it is, and people can think I'm an idiot if I'm wrong.
I think Scorsese co-wrote it with someone. I don't know if it was Schrader or someone else. But yeah, love that movie.
It's
Any
a
chance I
great
get to
movie.
recommend
Yeah,
it. And I just love the sort of like flip side of like
The
let's
inverse
take a regular
quad
guy.
look.
Yeah, let's take a regular guy and make him Jesus versus like let's take Jesus and just make him a regular guy. So Last Temptation of Christ. That's going to be my first one.
All right. I'm now going to go through my list of prison movies. So I have a list here. I'm not going to say all of them because there are more. So I'm going to keep it down.
We'll allow it for this one. Just we'll call this recommendation prison movies, and then you can just give examples of them. I would otherwise have to serve down some sort of penalty.
Well, how about I'll do it this way. I'll say, well, I could say the first film in the Human Condition trilogy. So I could say that, which is about the Human Condition trilogy is so Mizoguchi 9-hour epic split into 3 films. The first film is maybe the peak of that, but it's absolutely harrowing in terms of prisoner of war camps, and again operating in imperialist structures and the inability to be a good person in imperialist structures. That if you are good but a cog in a fascist machine, you are a good fascist, and that film is very good at conveying that. And Korhan Luke is very good about institutionalization, but I'm not going to talk about that. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence comes to mind again, but I'm not about that. There's got some Jesus fun. Welcome to the Terrordrome, which is such a cool British movie. I think one of the first films directed by a black woman in the UK, which is wild that it took that long. But again, it's about what happens when society becomes prison. Punishment Park, the faux documentary about the fake American prison system, is so harrowing and wild and just strange and prescient. But I'm not recommending any of those. Because instead, I'm recommending a film that is definitely not on the canon, but should be. Toshiaki Toyoda's 9 Souls. Are you familiar with this film?
I'm not.
It's an absolutely phenomenal film about it, and it is a prison film, but they are out of prison from the very beginning. But the kind of idea of the film, and it is a bunch of dudes primarily who, so they have escaped this prison, and it's the film technically a prison escape movie. The prison escape happens right at the beginning, but the thesis of the film is you can escape prison, but the prison will not lead you, and you've been mentally imprisoned. So it explores that if you have been incarcerated, it's that William Blake line of like the Mind Forge manacles of you have created your own prison in yourself, and you will always be imprisoned, and that prison works on people beyond its geographical reality. And it is such an insightful film about the problems of the justice system, and it obviously not being a system of justice. You can get, Angela Davis on, etc. Following these characters who are, and it doesn't want to sugarcoat them as nice people. Maybe they are not nice people at all, but there's a Kieslowski film, and I love Kieslowski, a short film about killing. There's the most persuasive film against the death penalty because it goes, this person is guilty and this is still bad. And that's a much more difficult argument to make, and a much more powerful argument of these people might be very, very bad people, but that a bad system to bad people is still a bad system. And if you can put it that way, then that's, if anything, more persuasive. So there's a shared humanity idea, and it's just a very insightful film about what incarceration and oppression does to people on a mental level. And is stylistic and awesome. And Toyota is such a fascinating, brilliant director. Underseen, undercelebrated.
Yeah, absolutely. I had not heard of that movie.
It's phenomenal.
That sounds amazing. I'm certainly adding that to the watch list. Great thing about recommendations is we talk about movies that are already on my watch list, and then I get to add new movies to my watch list, and then I look at my watch list and I'm overwhelmed because I'm like, there are too many movies to watch and I don't have enough time. Yeah. It's like, why do I have to work? I should just be watching movies all day.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, that's neither here nor there. Or I guess it is both here and there. For my second recommendation, I'm going to go with a book.
Cool.
I have not read, but a book that has been, again, on my reading list for quite some time.
If you say the King James Bible, I'm going to leave.
It's not the King James Bible.
Phew.
But this is a book that's been on my reading list for quite some time. A writer who I actually came across while I was trying to do some prep for this episode. The book is by is it Mark Harris or Mike Harris? I wrote down both here, and now I feel bad for not having his
Mr. Harris. M. Harris.
Mr. M. Harris. The book is called Pictures at a Revolution. It's about films, I believe, of 1967 that ushered in the sort of wave of new Hollywood. So Cool Hand Luke does get mentioned in it. Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, other movies from 67, I believe Point Blank as well. But really sort of about, this specific moment within film history and what it means for American filmmaking going forward. So that's a book that I've been really interested in reading. And then obviously after watching this movie, sort of shot back to the top of my reading list as one that I should check out. So apologies to Mr. Harris for not remembering your first name, but your book sounds like one that all movie fans should check out.
Yeah, because I was sure you were going to say Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, which is which I have read and is good, but is the kind of the very poppy sensibility history of the new Hollywood movement. A more rigorous version of that is something that very much appealed to me because I like Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, but it loves the drama of the whole thing and it gets a bit caught up in tabloidness as much as it tells me what happens.
That's currently sitting on my bookshelf.
It's
another
good.
one that I've not read, but intend to read very soon. Yeah. Awesome. What's your third recommendation?
I'm gonna go for another film, and obviously everyone that watches Cool Hand Luke thinks of this film straight away. You've watched Cool Hand Luke, which is a film about the cruelty of the prison system and what it does to man. So, a film that I think about when watching every other film, because I'm always thinking, why isn't this film more like this film? And that is, of course, Lang Nagai Kai's classic Ricky O, The Story of Ricky.
Dude, what an amazing movie.
One of the most incredible movies. You've got to see a man get punched through several times. Ricky O, The Story of Ricky is the anti-fascist prison movie for you.
Oh my God, that's hilarious. I love that I have you on and that you have brought up Ricky O, The Story of Ricky.
Should be in every canon every time.
Yeah, it absolutely should be. It also is a movie that we can recommend for every other movie in the canon. For
every movie that exists should be held against Ricky O, The Story of Ricky. One title alone, Ricky O, The Story of Ricky, is one of the greatest titles of anything ever. I just watched another film by the same director, which was also absolutely mad. The Cat does not sound wild, but is one of the goopiest, wildest films you'll see in your life. But yeah, Ricky O, The Story of Ricky, just
I'll have to
cinema.
check that out.
Based on a manga, I think. But pure cinema.
Many heads getting smashed, many bodies being punched through. Sort of like a video game in movie format, going through an oppressive prison system. Yeah, absolutely bonkers and just like great movie. I'm so happy that
if Cool Hand Luke had someone get like decapitated by a punch, it would be better. And Ricky, The Story of Ricky has that most frames.
Awesome. I love that we're ending with a fun one. Okay, my final recommendation is not quite as fun or amazing as Ricky O, The Story of Ricky, but I'm going with another prison movie about a dude who shows up and is able to sort of inspire the rest of the prisoners within that system to be maybe more fully realized individual versions of themselves. It's not as great as Ricky O, The Story of Ricky.
But you can say about every film. We do not give that caveat because no film is as great as Ricky O, The Story of Ricky.
Or as great as Cool Hand Luke. But it is also very hot. It also features dudes outside sweating a whole lot. I'm, of course, talking about Shia LaBeouf in 2005's Holes. If you want a movie about dudes in prison,
I did think about holes several times while watching this movie, but I wasn't brave enough to say it, and I appreciate you for that.
Wait, did you actually think of holes, or is this
yes, 100%.
Oh man,
there's a point where he digs a hole for the sake of it.
Yeah, and you're just like, oh yeah, I've seen this before. Shia LaBeouf, I know what you were getting at now. You're just trying to channel your
Shia LaBeouf, clearly you're a terrible human being. However, Holes, certified classic.
Yeah, absolute banger of a movie. Shia LaBeouf wishes that he could be, a third of the movie star that Paul Newman was. He does have some Newman in him. There was a period of time where we were like, he was going to be the next movie star.
Then news happened, and it turns out he's a bad human being. But
yeah. But yeah, okay. Stephen, before we say our final goodbyes, let's run through our recommendations one last time. You can go first. Give us all three.
Yes, I need to remember what I said now. Jesus Christ, I've been so distracted by holes. I'm not thinking. Paul Schrader's Blue Collar, which is absolutely wonderful. A whole bunch of prison movies I didn't recommend. Le Shrew was never even said, but what was said was Nine Souls, and then Ricky-O, The Story of Ricky, the only film.
I love it. The only film ever to exist. The only film that anyone ever needs to watch. My three are The Last Temptation of Christ, of course.
Yeah.
M. Harris's Pictures at a Revolution, book about New Hollywood, and of course, the other great prison movie, Holes. Stephen, thank you again.
It's funny because Le True does mean the hole, so Holes is calling back to the classic Le True, and I would say they're on par.
Very much so. Two movies in conversation with one another.
Definitely, and it's mutual, very mutual. Both very aware of the other, despite time not allowing that. It's somehow they are.
But maybe we don't need to read time as linear for
so
that.
True, so true.
Just for that purpose. Stephen, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.
An absolute blast. This is a great way to kick off season 4. If this is any indication of what we will have in store for you, listener, moving forward, I think we're going to have a great time. Stephen, where can people find you online? Where can they find the show? Where can people connect with you?
Yeah, if you go to thestacks.co.uk, you can find all kind of things being posted there. My long form writing about film. Mostly find me on Letterboxd, where I just write a lot and lots and lots and lots of words about film. So I am Stephen Gillespie on there. I think Stevenage is my handle, which you can find me through. But yeah, where all good podcasts are found, then please enjoy The Stacks, and I'm Thinking of Spoiling Things, and other things that exist in the ether.
I love it. Yeah, definitely check out The Stacks. It's a great show. Definitely add it to your movie podcast rotation. A lot of interesting stuff. Obviously, Stephen has a wealth of knowledge about movies. So if you want to learn more about just like cinema history and all of that good stuff, definitely check out the show there. Thank you for listening to us here at the Canon. We're very happy that you joined us, and as always, we appreciate the support. If you'd like to leave us a review, 5 stars on whatever podcast platform it is that you listen to us on, we would really appreciate that. If you're even able to leave us a little written review, it helps us grow the show, helps your friends find it, and all of that good stuff, so that we can continue to provide you with this list of essential movies. Like next week, we'll be talking about one of the funniest movies of all time. So a little bit different from Cool Hand Luke. We're going to be talking Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Hey, you covered that on the Stacks. Fun. There you go. That's I will be listening with eager ears. What a fun movie.
I love it. Can't wait for it. We're going to have Sailor and RJ, 2 of our beloved Screen Age Wasteland contributors, joining us for that one. It should be super fun. We will see you there. And as always, in the meantime, I will see you in the wasteland. Take care, y'all.